On a cool morning in March of 1945, Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto stood in a secured hangar on the outskirts of Nagoya, staring at a twisted section of aluminum that had been carefully transported from the crash site of an American bomber. The metal gleamed under the overhead lights with an almost supernatural quality, smoother and more uniform than anything he had ever seen produced in Japanese factories. Around him, 5 of Japan's most accomplished metallurgical engineers waited in silence, their faces betraying a mixture of scientific curiosity and something approaching dread. They had been summoned here to solve what military intelligence had classified as a priority puzzle: understanding the construction methods of the Boeing B-29 superfortress, the aircraft that had begun appearing over Japanese cities in numbers that seemed to multiply with each passing week. What none of them could have predicted was that examining this single piece of wreckage would fundamentally shatter their understanding of industrial capability and force them to confront an overwhelming truth about the conflict their nation was waging. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the following weeks, these engineers would discover that the aluminum in their hands represented not merely superior craftsmanship, but an entirely different approach to manufacturing that Japan could not replicate even with unlimited time and resources. Their findings would circulate through the highest levels of military and civilian leadership, contributing to a growing awareness that the outcome of this conflict had perhaps already been determined by factors that no amount of courage or sacrifice could overcome. Dr. Yamamoto was 53 years old, a graduate of Tokyo Imperial University, who had spent 3 decades perfecting aluminum alloy formulations for the Japanese aviation industry. His work had contributed to aircraft like the Mitsubishi Zero, which had achieved remarkable performance through the ingenious use of lightweight materials. He understood aluminum the way a master calligrapher understood ink and paper. Every alloy had its personality, its strengths and weaknesses, its response to heat and stress. He had believed, with the quiet confidence of deep expertise, that he knew everything worth knowing about aircraft-grade aluminum. The section before him measured approximately 2 meters in length and half a meter in width, clearly part of the aircraft's outer skin. It had been recovered from a B-29 that had gone down in the mountains northwest of Kobe, brought low by mechanical failure rather than defensive fire. This distinction mattered enormously to the engineers because it meant the metal had not been compromised by explosive damage. They were looking at aluminum in essentially its manufactured state, bearing only the stresses of the crash itself. The first thing Yamamoto noticed was the thickness. He measured it 3 times with his precision calipers, certain he had made an error. The skin was barely 1.5 millimeters thick in most places, thinner than the aluminum used in Japanese aircraft of comparable size and weight class. Yet, when he attempted to flex the section with his hands, applying the kind of pressure that would have permanently deformed domestic aluminum, the metal resisted with surprising stubbornness. It bent slightly, then sprang back to its original shape with a resilience that seemed almost organic. "This is not possible," he murmured to his colleague, Dr. Kenji Ishida, a specialist in stress analysis from the Nakajima Aircraft Company. Ishida was younger, in his early 40s, and had earned a reputation for creative problem-solving. He had been instrumental in developing lightweight structural approaches that had extended the range of Japanese fighter aircraft. Now, he ran his fingertips over the American metal with the delicate touch of a physician examining a patient. "The grain structure," Ishida said quietly. "It feels different, more consistent." Yamamoto nodded. Even through touch, both men could sense something unusual about the material. Aluminum alloy derived its strength from the microscopic crystalline structures that formed during the cooling and treatment process. Japanese aluminum had excellent grain structure by any reasonable standard, but it was never perfectly uniform. There were always variations, tiny inconsistencies that arose from fluctuations in temperature, impurities in the base metal, or simply the inherent chaos of the manufacturing process. These variations were considered normal, even acceptable. Engineers designed around them, adding safety margins to account for the weakest potential points in any given piece of material. But this American aluminum felt different under their fingers. It felt almost impossibly smooth, as if the grain structure beneath the surface was uniform in a way that Japanese manufacturing could not achieve. The team spent the first day conducting basic measurements and visual inspections. They photographed the section from every angle, documented the rivet patterns, and made preliminary notes on the apparent manufacturing methods. The rivets themselves were fascinating. They were flush with the surface, countersunk into the aluminum with a precision that minimized aerodynamic drag. Japanese aircraft used similar techniques, but the execution here was flawless. Every rivet head sat at exactly the same depth. Every hole was precisely the same diameter. It was the kind of consistency that suggested not just skilled workers, but a fundamentally different approach to quality control. That evening, Dr. Yamamoto returned to his small office in the research facility and began writing his initial observations in a leather-bound notebook. His handwriting, usually meticulous, grew increasingly hasty as he attempted to capture impressions that seemed to exceed his vocabulary. "The material suggests a manufacturing capability that I cannot fully explain," he wrote. "It is not simply that the Americans have produced good aluminum. They have produced aluminum that behaves as if the normal limitations of the manufacturing process do not apply." The next morning, the team began the more invasive phase of their analysis. Using precision cutting tools, they removed small samples from the wreckage for laboratory testing. Each cut required careful documentation because they could not afford to waste any of this precious material. Other crash sites were being examined by other teams, but intact sections of B-29 skin remained rare. The American aircraft had an unfortunate tendency, from the Japanese perspective, of either being destroyed completely by impact or crashing in locations that were difficult to reach. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, the team's spectrographic analyst, prepared the first sample for chemical composition testing. Tanaka was a precise man in his late 40s, trained in Germany before the current hostilities had made such international exchange impossible. He worked with methodical care, dissolving a tiny portion of the aluminum and preparing it for analysis in equipment that was itself a marvel of precision engineering. The spectrograph would reveal the exact elements present in the alloy and their proportions, providing the recipe that the Americans had used to create this remarkable material. The results came back that afternoon, and they created the first serious puzzle. The alloy was an aluminum-copper-magnesium formulation, similar in general composition to alloys used in Japanese aircraft. The proportions were within ranges that Japanese metallurgists would have recognized as reasonable. There were trace elements present, including manganese and zinc, but nothing exotic, nothing that Japan could not theoretically obtain or produce. "The composition is not remarkable," Tanaka reported to the assembled team, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "It is a good alloy, certainly, but it is not fundamentally different from alloys we have worked with. The unusual properties must come from the manufacturing process, not the formula itself." This conclusion shifted the team's focus from chemistry to methodology. How had the Americans taken ordinary ingredients and produced extraordinary results? The answer, they would discover, lay in a series of manufacturing innovations that represented the application of mass production principles to aerospace-grade materials. Dr. Ishida led the analysis of the metal's physical structure. Using microscopic examination and a series of stress tests, he began to build a picture of how the aluminum had been created. What he found astonished him. The grain structure was not merely consistent, it was consistent in a way that suggested the Americans had achieved precise control over every phase of the manufacturing process, from initial melting to final heat treatment. In Japanese aluminum production, even at the most advanced facilities, there was always variation. A batch of metal melted in the morning might have slightly different properties than a batch melted in the afternoon, because the temperature of the furnace, the exact timing of the pour, and dozens of other variables could never be perfectly controlled. These variations were managed through quality testing and sorting. Batches that fell outside acceptable parameters were rejected or diverted to less demanding applications. It was a system that produced excellent material, but it was inherently wasteful and inconsistent. The American aluminum showed no such variation. Every section they tested, every sample they examined, displayed the same properties within remarkably tight tolerances. It was as if the Americans had found a way to make the manufacturing process itself perfectly consistent, eliminating the chaos and variation that Japanese engineers considered inevitable. "They have achieved something we believed to be impossible," Ishida said during a team meeting in the second week of analysis. "They have industrialized perfection." The implications of this statement took time to fully absorb. What Ishida was describing was not simply better engineering. It was a different philosophy of manufacturing, one that prioritized absolute consistency over individual craftsmanship. Japanese production methods relied heavily on skilled workers who could adjust for variations in materials and conditions, using experience and judgment to achieve good results despite imperfect inputs. American production methods, as revealed by this aluminum, seemed to eliminate the need for such adjustments by controlling the inputs so precisely that the outputs were automatically consistent. Dr. Yamamoto found himself thinking about the numbers. Intelligence reports suggested that the Americans were producing B-29 aircraft at a rate that seemed almost fantastical, perhaps 40 or 50 per month from multiple factories. Each aircraft required thousands of square meters of aluminum skin, all of which apparently met these extraordinary standards. The Japanese aviation industry, working at maximum capacity with skilled craftsmen in every position, could not approach such numbers even with aluminum of ordinary quality. With aluminum of this quality, the gap became not merely large but effectively infinite. The team's third week of analysis focused on the practical implications of their findings. Dr. Sato Nakamura, the youngest member of the team at 36, was responsible for determining whether Japanese industry could replicate the American methods. Nakamura had spent time at the Sumitomo Metal Industries facility and understood both the capabilities and limitations of Japanese aluminum production. His assessment was thorough and ultimately devastating. To achieve this level of consistency, Nakamura explained in his report, the Americans must be using centralized production with extremely precise process controls. Every variable that affects metal quality must be measured and adjusted continuously. This requires instrumentation and automation that we do not possess and cannot quickly develop. He went on to describe the investments that would be necessary: new furnaces with advanced temperature controls, automated systems for timing, pause, and managing cooling rates, testing equipment at every stage of production to identify and correct deviations before they propagated through the system, training programs to teach workers to operate machinery rather than to make judgments. And underlying all of this, an electrical infrastructure capable of powering these systems reliably and consistently, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Even if we had unlimited resources, Nakamura concluded, we could not implement these changes in less than 3 to 5 years, and we do not have unlimited resources. This last point was critical. Japan's war economy was already strained to its limits. Aluminum production depended on bauxite imports that were increasingly threatened by American interdiction of shipping lanes. Electrical generation was declining as fuel supplies dwindled. Skilled workers were being pulled into military service. The idea of diverting resources to a multi-year manufacturing improvement program, while simultaneously trying to produce aircraft for immediate operational needs, was simply not feasible. The team prepared a preliminary report for the military authorities who had commissioned their study. The document was technical in nature, filled with spectrographic data, stress test results, and manufacturing analysis, but its conclusions were clear enough that any reader could understand them. The Americans had achieved a level of industrial capability in aluminum production that Japan could not match or counter. This capability was being applied to the production of aircraft in numbers that would continue to grow. The technological gap represented by this single piece of aluminum was not a gap that courage, determination, or sacrifice could close. Dr. Yamamoto was asked to present the findings personally to a group of senior officers at a meeting in Tokyo. He traveled by train, carrying the report in a leather satchel, watching the countryside pass by and thinking about what he was going to say. The cities he passed showed the effects of the American air campaign: damaged buildings, disrupted transportation, an atmosphere of tension that seemed to hang over everything like smoke. He thought about the men who would receive his report and what they might do with the information. He hoped they would understand that he was not expressing defeatism, but simply describing reality as his analysis had revealed it. The meeting took place in a conference room in the Military Affairs Building, a Western-style structure that had somehow escaped damage. Yamamoto stood at one end of a long table, facing perhaps a dozen officers of various ranks and services. He spoke for 30 minutes using charts and diagrams to illustrate his points, keeping his voice steady and his manner professional. He described the aluminum's unusual properties, the manufacturing methods that must have produced them, and the resources that would be required to replicate those methods in Japan. When he finished, there was silence. Then, one of the senior officers, a naval commander whose name Yamamoto did not catch, leaned forward and asked a question that cut through all the technical detail. "Doctor, in your expert opinion, can we continue to produce aircraft capable of opposing these American bombers?" Yamamoto considered his response carefully. "We can produce aircraft," he said. "Our engineers are skilled, and our workers are dedicated. But the aircraft we produce will continue to require more material and more labor than equivalent American aircraft. Our production rates will remain a fraction of theirs, and the gap will widen over time, because their manufacturing efficiency allows them to improve quickly, while ours does not." Another officer asked whether there were any shortcuts, any ways to accelerate Japanese manufacturing improvement. Yamamoto had to admit that there were not. The American advantages were systemic, built into the entire structure of their industrial economy. You could not copy them piecemeal any more than you could copy a single chapter of a book and expect to understand the whole story. The meeting ended without any dramatic declarations or decisions. Yamamoto returned to Nagoya and resumed his work, analyzing additional wreckage samples as they became available. But the mood among the engineering team had changed. They continued to approach their work with professionalism and thoroughness, but there was a heaviness to their discussions that had not been present before. They had looked into the machinery of American production and seen something that defied their expectations. Not magic, not some impossible technology, but simply the relentless application of precision and scale in ways that Japanese industry could not match. Over the following months, the B-29 raids increased in frequency and destructive power. The engineering team's findings circulated through various channels, contributing to a growing body of evidence about American industrial superiority. Other teams were conducting similar analyses of different components, engines, electrical systems, defensive armaments. Their conclusions pointed in the same direction. The American war machine was not just larger than Japan's, it was operating on different principles, producing more with less, achieving consistency and reliability that seemed almost mechanical in their perfection. Dr. Ishida, the stress analyst, became particularly interested in the implications of the aluminum findings for aircraft survivability. He calculated that the American approach allowed the B-29 to achieve the same structural strength as Japanese bombers while using approximately 30% less material. This meant lighter aircraft with greater range and payload capacity, which translated directly into strategic advantage. It also meant that American factories could produce more aircraft from the same amount of raw aluminum, multiplying their numerical superiority even further. "They have solved the equation differently," Ishida explained to Yamamoto during one of their many conversations. "We try to make the best possible aircraft with the materials and methods we have. They have changed the materials and methods to make the aircraft they need. It seems like a small distinction, but it represents a completely different relationship between design and production." Yamamoto understood what his colleague meant. Japanese aircraft designers were brilliant, capable of creating machines that pushed the limits of performance. But they were always constrained by the realities of Japanese manufacturing. They had to design aircraft that skilled workers could build with available materials and tools. American designers apparently faced no such constraints. They could specify materials with properties that their manufacturing system would then produce. The factories served the designs rather than the designs serving the factories. This insight led Yamamoto to a broader realization about the nature of industrial power. Japan had built its military strength on the dedication and skill of its people, qualities that could not be quantified but were nonetheless real. American strength came from systems and processes, from the ability to organize machinery and labor into configurations that produced reliable outputs at enormous scale. Both approaches had merit, but in a prolonged conflict, the American approach had decisive advantages. Systems could run continuously without exhaustion. Processes could be duplicated across multiple locations. Skill could only exist in the individuals who possessed it, and those individuals could not be multiplied the way factories could. The war situation continued to deteriorate throughout the spring and summer of 1945. American aircraft appeared over Japanese cities with increasing frequency, and Japanese defenses could do little to stop them. The engineering team received reports of other captured equipment analyses, each adding to the picture of American industrial capability. A study of American trucks revealed similar principles: standardized components, precise manufacturing, designs optimized for mass production rather than individual performance. A study of American medical supplies found the same patterns: consistent quality, efficient packaging, enormous quantities. The Japanese military leadership responded to this information in various ways. Some officers refused to accept its implications, insisting that Japanese spirit and determination would overcome material disadvantages. Others began to consider what the findings meant for the war's likely outcome. A few started to think about what would come after, how Japan would rebuild, and what it might learn from the American approach to industry and production. Dr. Yamamoto found himself in an unusual position. His scientific training demanded that he follow evidence to its logical conclusions, but those conclusions were difficult to reconcile with his identity as a Japanese citizen and his desire for his country to succeed. He resolved this tension by focusing on the future rather than the present. Japan had lost this particular competition for industrial supremacy, but the competition itself would continue. The techniques and methods that the Americans had developed were not secrets that could be permanently kept. After the conflict ended, whatever form that ending might take, Japan would have access to this knowledge. The question would be whether Japan had the wisdom and determination to adopt it. He began to keep a separate notebook, recording not just technical findings, but also his thoughts on how Japanese industry might be transformed. He wrote about precision manufacturing, statistical quality control, standardized processes, and continuous improvement. He wrote about training workers to operate systems, rather than to exercise individual judgment, while also preserving the creativity and dedication that were genuine Japanese strengths. He wrote about building industrial infrastructure that could support advanced manufacturing, reliable electrical supplies, transportation networks, communication systems that allowed for coordination across vast distances. These notes were personal, not part of any official report. Yamamoto had no idea whether he would survive the conflict or whether his ideas would ever matter. But the act of writing them helped him process what he had learned and maintain a sense of purpose, despite the increasingly grim situation. The final months of the conflict brought changes that the engineering team observed, with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The American air attacks reached a crescendo and then suddenly stopped. News came of unprecedented events, difficult to fully comprehend. The team's work continued in a desultory fashion, but everyone understood that the context had fundamentally changed. Japan was going to have to become something different, and the question was what that something would be. Dr. Yamamoto's wartime work ended, but his career was just beginning its most important phase. The American occupation brought many changes to Japan, including access to precisely the manufacturing knowledge that Yamamoto had identified as decisive. American industrial engineers arrived to help rebuild Japanese factories, and they brought with them the techniques and methods that had produced the B-29 aluminum: statistical process control, precision instrumentation, systematic quality management. Yamamoto became a liaison between these American advisors and Japanese industry, translating not just language but concepts. He found that many American engineers were surprised by the Japanese interest in their methods. In the United States, these approaches were considered routine, even boring. The Americans were already looking ahead to new innovations, taking their manufacturing excellence for granted. They did not fully understand how revolutionary their methods appeared to engineers from countries where such capabilities did not exist. Japanese industry embraced these methods with extraordinary enthusiasm. The same dedication and attention to detail that had characterized Japanese craftsmanship was now applied to systematic manufacturing improvement. Within a few years, Japanese factories were not just matching American quality standards, but exceeding them. The students had learned from the teachers and then surpassed them, applying Japanese cultural strengths to American systematic approaches. Dr. Ishida, the stress analyst, became a consultant to the Japanese automotive industry, helping companies like Toyota and Nissan develop manufacturing processes that would eventually make Japanese cars famous for their reliability. He often told the story of the B-29 aluminum to young engineers, using it to illustrate the importance of manufacturing consistency and the potential for systematic improvement. Dr. Nakamura, who had assessed Japan's inability to replicate American methods during the conflict, became a leader in Japan's electronics industry. He helped establish manufacturing standards that enabled Japanese companies to produce components with levels of precision that exceeded even American capabilities. When American companies began purchasing Japanese components for their most demanding applications, Nakamura saw it as the completion of a circle that had begun in that Nagoya hangar. The other members of the engineering team followed similar paths, applying their wartime learning to peacetime reconstruction. They became teachers, consultants, and executives, spreading the insights they had gained from that single piece of American aluminum. Japan's post-conflict industrial miracle had many causes, but one of them was certainly the determination of engineers like Yamamoto and his colleagues to understand and then master the manufacturing methods that had proven so decisive. Dr. Yamamoto himself retired in the late 1960s after a career that included positions at major corporations and universities. He had trained hundreds of young engineers, always emphasizing the importance of systematic thinking and precise process control. His personal notebooks from the conflict, including his speculations about how Japan might transform its industry, were donated to a technical library where they could be studied by future generations. In 1972, Yamamoto received an unexpected visitor, an American aerospace engineer named Robert Harrison, who was researching the history of B-29 production. Harrison had learned of Yamamoto's wartime analysis and wanted to hear about it firsthand. The two men spent an afternoon together, comparing notes and sharing perspectives on events that had taken place nearly 3 decades earlier. Harrison was fascinated by Yamamoto's account of examining the aluminum and gradually realizing its implications. He confirmed many of Yamamoto's wartime deductions about American manufacturing methods and added details that Yamamoto had not known. The aluminum alloy that had so impressed the Japanese team had been produced by a process called continuous casting, which allowed for much more precise control over cooling rates and grain structure than traditional batch methods. The consistency that Yamamoto had observed was indeed the result of advanced instrumentation and automated process controls, technologies that had been developed for other industries and adapted for aerospace production. But what struck Yamamoto most was Harrison's casual attitude toward these achievements. For the American engineer, they were simply standard practice, the way things were done. He expressed admiration for Japanese manufacturing quality and predicted that Japan would soon be leading the world in many industrial categories. He did not seem to understand the significance of this prediction, how remarkable it was that a country that had been unable to match American aluminum quality was now poised to exceed it in multiple fields. After Harrison left, Yamamoto sat for a long time in his garden, thinking about the arc of his career and the transformation he had witnessed. Japan had looked at that B-29 aluminum and seen a mirror that reflected its own limitations. But rather than despairing, Japanese engineers had used that reflection to understand what needed to change. They had learned from the experience rather than being defeated by it. And now, a generation later, Japan was producing materials and products that the world regarded as benchmarks of quality. The aluminum itself had long since been lost, probably melted down for recycling during the desperate final months of the conflict. But its influence lived on in the engineers it had educated and the industries they had helped to build. What had seemed in 1945 like evidence of insurmountable American superiority had become, in hindsight, a lesson in the possibility of transformation and the power of systematic improvement. Yamamoto died in 1978, at the age of 86. His obituary mentioned his contributions to Japanese metallurgy and manufacturing, but did not describe the specific incident that had shaped so much of his thinking. For him, though, that moment in the Nagoya hangar remained vivid. The aluminum gleaming under the lights, the growing realization of what it represented, and the determination to understand and eventually master the methods that had produced it. The story of that analysis illustrates several important themes about industrial competition and technological change. First, it shows that manufacturing capability can be as important as design innovation. Japan had produced excellent aircraft designs, but could not manufacture them with the consistency and efficiency that strategic success required. Second, it demonstrates that industrial advantages are not permanent. The American methods that seemed so far ahead in 1945 were being matched and exceeded by Japan within 20 years. Third, it reveals the importance of learning from adversity. The Japanese engineers who examined American equipment during the conflict could have simply documented its superiority and moved on. Instead, they analyzed it deeply, understood the principles behind it, and applied those principles to their own industrial development. The B-29 superfortress flew in a world that no longer exists, its aluminum long since recycled into countless other forms. But the lessons that engineers like Dr. Yamamoto drew from examining its materials continue to influence manufacturing practice around the world. The next time you encounter a product noted for its precision and reliability, whether it comes from Japan or anywhere else, you are seeing the legacy of systematic manufacturing improvement that those wartime analyses helped to establish. The metal that should not have existed in 1945 turned out to be a preview of the industrial future, a future that Japanese engineers studied carefully and then helped to create. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.